Welcome, everybody, again to another episode of Faith Unaltered. This is Cosmic Corner, and we're going to be joined tonight by my favorite twin, Troy, and my other twin, apparently, Saint Sean. And so welcome you guys to the show. I'm really excited about tonight, and I know that this is going to be a really, really great conversation. And I hope already that we're going to do this again. I'm excited to be able to do things like this, but I especially am excited for the trio that we have lined up right now, because I feel like I mesh pretty well with both of these gentlemen. So since you're to my right, I'll start with you, Troy. What's going on, bud? Welcome back.
Well, a lot has happened. We had Beryl just go through, and the eye went over us, so we lost power for a few days, and some damage to our trees, but no damage to the house. And all friends, family, and coworkers seem to be in good health. Only a couple of them are still without power, so keep Houston in your prayers.
Man, praise God, though. Yeah, I'm glad that it could go a lot differently. You know, that could have been much worse. So blessed, man, blessed already. But I'm glad that you guys have your power restored, and pray that the Lord expedites the process of getting everyone else set up. So welcome back, Sean. This is your second Cosmic Corner episode, racking it up, looking really sweet in the 3M merch there. I like that. Shout out to Nico and the 3M channel. This is my plea to get my own merch, so let's get on that. My favorite Serbian friend. Apparently we look like triplets. People have noticed. They've noticed. It's official.
Nice.
Right on. And Sean needs a nickname. He's Saint Sean to you, so that is his nickname. But yeah, if you guys want to check out more stuff from what Sean's been doing with Nico on 3M, look up the Myths, Mysteries, and Majesty channel on YouTube, and check out their what did you guys title it? What's the name of your segment? Huh?
Eerie Encounters.
That's right. Eerie Encounters. I kept wanted to say creepy encounters, but I knew that was wrong. Eerie Encounters, where they read through and comment on some really interesting, scary stories. But yeah,
what we wanted to follow the alliteration of 3M, so EE and MMM.
I like that. I like
Nice.
that. Clever. Very good. Yeah, it's kind of like the parallelism, but that's another story. So tonight we're talking about what I think is probably one of our favorite authors, each of us, is C.S. Lewis, and a very particular book that Lewis said that this was his favorite work of fiction that he ever did. And so with that being said, it's obviously set apart from other things that he's written. I'm sure that most people who have been exposed to Lewis know at least about the Narnia series. Some that have gone a little bit deeper know about the Ransom trilogy that he wrote, which was his sci-fi trilogy novels. And Till We Have Faces is what we're going to be talking about tonight, which is a book that's rather unique. And it's a very interesting take on a very, very old story. What it is ultimately a very clever retelling of the myth of Psyche and Cupid. And so it's a very interesting, like I said, retelling. This is not an original narrative entirely from Lewis, but boy, has he gone and ran with it, because the original is very much a different kind of take. And what he did was give a depth that perhaps could have been there initially, maybe in some of the forms of the story as it morphs throughout time. What we have now is what's left of something that's probably much older. But in general, what he does is kind of give this really, Lewis style depth to something that would have been glossed over if you just went to the original story. You probably wouldn't have considered any of the things that he brings and all of the elements that he introduces. So it is definitely worth the read, even if you're familiar with mythology. It is not the telling that you might think that it is. It is very much of its own accord a new story. And so with that being said, let's kind of open up with like a gist here. Let's say what exactly is it for you guys? Because I know that I was drawn back to this story by way of Troy's influence. And so what is it that draws you guys to engage with this story?
Oh man, it was actually a recommendation from somebody I really treasured their input, and I had tried to read it before, and it was a really rough read. I didn't get through the first quarter of it before I was kind of disconnected from the main character. I didn't really like it, and they were like, "No, you need to finish the book." And I was like, "What is that? It's been poor so far. What is it? What does it mean? Finish the book?" And so, thank God for Audible. I was like, "All right, well, then I'll just listen to it in the background and see how that goes." And the way that C.S. Lewis has woven in a very difficult story at the beginning, playing instead of the hero or the heroine of the Cupid and Psyche story, he chooses the practically the villain in that myth and tells the story from her perspective. And so the tone and tenor of that character is supposed to be grating. And so the feeling of uncomfortable, not really relating directly, you get the more you read it, the more you relate. um, Kind of throws you off, and it's supposed to, so that in the end there's a trope that goes through the entire thing of the main character being shown a mirror. And I think this book does an incredible job of being a mirror to the reader, and making you wrestle with maybe unspoken and even unconscious motivations behind our supposed acts of love that are more selfish in their perspective. I'm doing what's best for me for you, if that makes sense. And you see that story told, and it's the end of the story that actually is the hook, the thing that gets you to go, oh, wait a minute, I need to reread the whole story again. And then you read it again, and then you get to the another part, and you're going, oh, this is another, I need to read the story again. And so each time you reread it, you get these subtleties that when you're in the first reading of it you're going to miss, because they're hints that only at the end, when you know the end of the story, do you go, oh my gosh, he masterfully wove so many connections and threads through the entire story that, like, as C.S. Lewis put it, his favorite book, I think this is one of his most masterful books as well. So that's my take. Sean?
Fair enough. What do you got for us, Sean?
Well, while you were talking, I was just thinking, the end part, that book 2 of the book, it's a lot like the New Testament. It's the key to unlocking the Old Testament, right? And so you have all of this. It seems like it's a coherent story, but you have these kind of disparate little breadcrumbs that are dropped along the way. And then the New Testament comes and it ties them all up together. And so all of a sudden, this story that you really couldn't see at the beginning is now just jumping off the page at you. And so I really feel like that's what was happening. And when you said that mirrors, I was like, okay, well, I know the mirror that was in the pillar room, and I know the mirror of the water. But as you were talking, it just hit me. Every person that Orwell interacted with was a mirror. And so every person's interaction with her was really their own interaction with, it was like they were having to do, they were seeing their relationship with her. Like, the king's anger, and he was just this angry, terrible person. And Barty only saw her as a pupil, and so he esteemed her as a pupil. And Fox only saw her as a grandchild, and so he couldn't imagine her with a sword. Yeah, it's just like this. Every person that interacts with her, it's just this mirror, which is, I don't know what to do with that yet, because I just thought of it.
Yeah, I know what you mean. It is kind of difficult on the fly. And we just got a question in the side chat. Yes, fair point. Spoiler alert. If you have not yet read this book, we're going to be talking about this book in depth. If you have not yet read or listened to this book, as Troy said, bless the Lord for Audible. Please go online and check out this book. If you have a copy of this book sitting on your shelf that you said one day, today is the day. friend, please
Mhm.
go back and check out this book and come back and check out this conversation and tell us why we're wrong. No, I'm playing. Go and read this book and be blessed, please, because it's something that, as Troy said, even if you started and said, this isn't for me, but I'll come back to it later. No, you have to trudge to the end because there's something special that's waiting for you in the closure of a story like this. Because Lewis was no fool. He doesn't tell a story simply for the entertainment value of the story.
Right.
And he does not tell a story simply for the sake of shocking you because I'm going to make the villain the main character. That's what we're left with in nowadays, our entertainment nowadays. When somebody does this swap, they do this inversion. I'm going to tell the story from the villain's perspective. That is explicitly almost every single time, simply for the fact that they're going to retell their perspective to make you identify with this character. That is not what Lewis is doing here. He's not pulling any punches, and he's not trying to make you feel bad for this person who is obviously in the wrong in the story, right? That is not what's happening. And so please do your best to go and try to finish this story. If it's hard for you, all three of us understand that, believe me, right?
Mhm.
But as Troy said, the end baptizes the whole. Please go back. Please go back. It is so worth it. That being said, spoiler alert, ta-da, we're talking about it. So anyway, as far as the mirrored thing, what I think is really most interesting is that we have this kind of metaphorical need to see things as they are, right? And what Lewis so cleverly does is show that even as you're staring plainly, you still don't see it, right? Like, one of the things that really was striking about this book for me as I was going through it the second time, because I had read this about 6 years ago, and I like Troy said, I didn't like it. I didn't get it, right? But coming back to it this time with fresh eyes, and however much the new perspective that every day is going to bring me happens to inform this whole thing about it, going back through it a second time and recognizing so much about this character, that the main character is someone that, let's say, in some really sad, pathetic way, mirrors me, right? And that was the thing that stood out to me the entire time, was like, but she's preaching my resentment right back to me. And she doesn't even know that that's what she's doing, because she thinks she's being self-reflective and honest. And what it is this remarkable combination for the main character between this reflective honesty and self-reflection and a complete lack of self-awareness, like an absolute lack of self-awareness.
Right.
But it's so strange because, like you said, Troy, you almost have to read the book twice for it to have the meaning that it has.
Mm-hmm.
So this is definitely not a normal kind of novel where you're going to read it and go, well, that was quaint, and then put it down and never come back to it.
I think this is the closest C.S. Lewis gets to wisdom literature, and that it's not something to be chewed once. It's to be chewed on multiple times, and to turn the diamond a few more times and see what other facets you can hear or see. I think I first listened to the whole of it 2 years ago, and I've been listening to it on a regular, probably once every quarter or so. So I've gone through it like 10 times, and every time I'm going, oh my gosh, that little detail here, and this little diamond here, and this little treasure here. And I'm going, oh my gosh, it's all connected. So yeah, it's not a story that you get the whole of it in one reading, unless you have what is it called? A didactic memory, or one of those memories that just holds the entire thing, so that once you get new information, you can recall the whole of all the information before. If you don't have that, this is a story that keeps giving, and which is wonderful. It's a meal that just keeps giving. And I think that's probably one of the strongest arguments for why this is probably one of his best works. Not that any of his other novels don't have those little treasures that keep giving. The more that you read, the more you see the depth of what he was writing. Mm-hmm. But, Tolkien had a pretty scathing critique of C.S. Lewis, that he put all of his mystery so easy to read and on the forefront of things. Narnia, Aslan, of course, Christ, right? This book is not like that. And no. This book is a lot more shaded, a lot more veiled.
Veiled.
To use a term that is very important to this book. So
yeah, I agree with that. I think and to be let's say a little bit more forward with the actual flow of the story, the idea of something being both a barrier and a reflection is kind of what I think is one of the main themes running throughout the entire story. I guess let's start with the beginning. This book has a really like striking opening where you meet the main character, you meet the setting of the main character, and the kind of overall like it's like a harsh brutality of the story is like that's the impression that I get walking into the first chapter is really like this character who you don't know yet. You kind of want to know them because they're the main character. It's like that's naturally the inclination of the story, is to kind of identify with this person. But there's very little to go off of personality wise in the first chapter. It's mostly this description of what's happening around her and why she's rather like frightened or off put by her situation, things like that. There's the introduction of the father, who plays a really important role for the character in the story. And the relationship between the daughter and the father is not one that it doesn't match the, let's say, traditional relationship of father-daughter. There's none of the doting. There's none of the admiration. There's none of the affection that ought to be there for a daughter. And it's specifically because of one of the main elements of the story is, in fact, that this main character, her name is Orwell, is actually a rather ugly person. And not just like in here. You don't even know that yet. Here, she's not attractive. She's somebody that we would probably say is homely or mannish kind of looking, right? Is the impression that you kind of get from it. And so it's an interesting thing to kind of play with the idea of like her face without anything in front of it is already a means of hiding herself, right? And it's not something that she's doing purposefully. It's something that makes her unremarkable and something that other people wouldn't pursue, right? Like they wouldn't, nobody's going up to her and being like, I want to know this woman, right? There's something that's hiding her from the world already. And it's because she isn't this beautiful, striking woman. You know what I mean? She's this kind of not attractive person, right? The picture that I immediately get in my head narratively is in fact from Isaiah, where he says that the Christ was somebody that was not attractive and not somebody that you would have walked up to because of his looks or because of anything about his charisma or his person in general. He was not someone to be approached because of beauty. He was somebody that was kind of a normal guy. He was average. You know what I mean? At best, average. And that's saying something, because this was in a world where makeup and things like that were not exactly a common everyday thing. You'd have to be pretty wealthy to be able to do anything about your appearance in that way. And so in general, it's kind of interesting to consider that Christ is actually, in some sense, in the same boat as this person, kind of off.
Yeah, I think that here's a quote from the book on her own description of herself. Nature's hand slipped when she made me anyway, said I. If I'm to be hard features as a man, why shouldn't I fight like a man too? Is that right? You do have this nothing attractive of this person, like so much so that like even her father is berates her on her ugliness in front of people, and exposes her to her own ugliness multiple times just to make the point that she's useless as a firstborn to him. When he wants a son, this is what the gods gave him. And, you know, girls just plagued with girls, right? There's that part in the story that's just, it's humorous to see the whine of the king about how unfortunate he is to have her.
Mm.
So
Yeah. Yeah, I think that the king's ingratitude is something that let's say kind of passes off. It's weird because she obviously doesn't want anything to do with the king, right?
Mhm.
And in the same way that oftentimes when we grow up with parents that are, let's say, less than ideal, we look at them and be like, no, not me. I'm not
Right.
going to be like them. 20 years later, you have your own children. Come to find out, yeah, you're just like them. You know what I mean? In some of the ways that you obviously would not want to be like them, it sometimes shines through in a way that you weren't even looking for until it makes itself really obvious because of your pain or because of your difficulty, because of, it's not easy to raise children, to borrow from Dr. Peterson. Oftentimes people are way too willing to allow their children to become something they don't like because they think that allowance is them being loving to the child, right? And it's not a lack of parameters that makes your children lovely, right? Like that's not what makes them lovely to you. And so if you, and the scripture says something similar, it says that it's the bastard child that's kind of neglected by the father. It's the real son that gets the structure to be like the father, right? And the father in this story is not without structure. In fact, he's kind of a tyrannical piece of work, this guy, and so this is the world that she's really growing up in and rooted deeply in, is this world that says it's going my way or else. Right. And so that's kind of the aesthetic of the whole first chapter and opening of the story, is this like, I will enforce my will on the world. Right. And that's the world that she grew up in. That's the person she doesn't want to become. Right. And so in some real interesting sense, that informs the texture of the rest of the story. You don't exactly know that when you're reading it in the first place, but later on you kind of get the hints of the fact that she really was drinking deeply on her father's disdain. Like she really was like, like when I in America, when we have somebody who's real like stout and big, tall guy, broad shoulders, beefy kind of dude, we say he's corn fed, right? That's a farm boy. He's corn fed. He's a big guy. He's been fed on corn, right? This girl was fed on something that made her spirit haughty and weak all at the same time, right? And so with that in mind, that's kind of just the texture of how she thinks, how she addresses what's going on. This is another, the father calls her awful things, right? There's this constant berating, there's this constant belittling, right? That follows her, right? And then she begins later on to try to wear it like a badge of honor, but it does nothing to remedy the pain. You know what I mean? And so there's this kind of like weakness that develops also in what we would nowadays call self-esteem. It's kind of a weird way of putting it, but there's something that's kind of brewing under the surface for her in her own spirit that kind of inclines her. It lends itself to her being that much more like the father, especially in the moments when she thinks she's least like him. You know what I mean? Where it's like, it's completely subconscious at that point.
There's multiple times in the story where she'll either talk about her father's anger and rages, and then within sentences she's in a rage. Now she doesn't act on that rage directly as her father did, but there's quite often times where she'll be criticizing her father and the rages and the way that he did things, and then turn around and do something almost identical, but veiled. It's an interesting way of putting it. Is like she fed on that, and it's become a subconscious part of her that she can't step away from. And even though she criticizes that thing, that shadow is still inside of her.
Yeah. And then she's kind of stuck between these two things because she doesn't want to be like her father, right? And she realizes that she's hideous, right? But also, she doesn't want to be beautiful because she sees Redival, her sister, who is beautiful. And so now she has this kind of, she talks about when she's young, and the golden curls getting cut, and she's
Mhm.
like, well, nobody mentioned anything about mine. And so you see this, at first it starts as like she wants to be pretty like her sister, but then quickly her sister becomes just a, like, she views her like just a foolish trollop, somebody who just has no sense and is all beauty and whatever. And so beauty kind of, I wonder if that's part of the wearing her ugliness like a badge of honor, of
Mhm.
like, at least I'm not like her.
Yes. And there throughout the entire story, not to get too far ahead, but there's multiple times where she comes in contact with something beautiful or something attractive, and at the offset is already distrusting. The only thing beautiful that she sees and that she's attracted to is Psyche. Everything else that she runs into when it comes to beauty, she disdains almost immediately.
I agree with that. I think with the introduction, and that's technically the next portion of the story, is the introduction of the other main character, which very, very cleverly is not enough of a tangential character that you think she's not part of the main of the story, but is background enough, because you're getting most of the story, if I'm honest, is actually the psychological events for the
Mhm.
main character rather than the external narrative so much. Right. And so you're really getting to know this person, like, in a way that you almost know no one else except yourself in this way.
Mhm.
Right. And so that's why I say it's this striking self-reflection kind of story, while at the same time being an utter lack of knowing who in the hell she is.
Yeah.
Right? She has no clue who she actually is. She has this weird picture in her mind, like most of us probably do, of who it is that we are. And
Right.
who it is that we are in our own mind usually is what we want other people to see us as, which is why I think that this outward display of, well, I'm going to pretend like it doesn't bother me, because I think that this unbothered portion of me is a strength to be shut down and build walls and create distance between me and the rest of the world. I think that this is a strength, right? And in the same way that any kind of technology or boundary or barrier or armor is a power or a strength, it's also something that betrays a fundamental weakness. And the weakness is the thing that you're guarding. We use armor to cover our chest because inside are the most vulnerable parts of us. There's a reason, right? But if you went around in armor all the time, even when it wasn't necessary, you would grow weaker in some capacity. In the same way that, like, let's say we found out really vividly during the COVID times, that when you wash your hands continually and you keep yourself from dirt and filth continually, you become weaker against those things because you build no sense of tolerance, right? And
Right.
so there's this two sides of the protection. Yes, there is some reason for her to grow used to the fact that other people seem to treat her with disdain and everything else, and it is something of a kind of fortitude to be able to just absorb that and move on. But at the same time, she gets to a point where this becomes a performance rather than, like, she's not at all integrated with this fact.
Mhm.
She uses it as like a
A
diversion.
character. Yeah, a
Yeah, like
character.
yeah, exactly. She's playing a role. You know what I mean? So she doesn't know herself. You know what I mean? She knows the character that she's put on for people, but
And
she doesn't really know herself.
and technically she rejects the self that she is, because it talks about her putting on the queen and putting Orwell emaciated into a practically a dungeon in her mind, and that every once in a while Orwell would get the strength to come out in tears in mourning for Psyche, but for the most part she would shove that back down to be the queen.
She said it was like being with child but backwards, because Oral
Yes.
was getting smaller and smaller and weaker and weaker.
Yes.
Uh, and to comment on what you were saying, Davidson, uh, it, it's something interesting. Swordsmiths found this out as they started using iron instead of bronze, if you temper iron and make it too hard, it quickly becomes brittle and it'll break.
Mm-hmm.
So being hard can be a detriment. There's a point where durability requires flexibility.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which she learns near the end of the book.
Yes. No, very much. Very much. So the meat of the story, really, now that I think because we've done a pretty good job describing the setting and the main character specifically. The reason why Psyche becomes such a compelling character in this story is because Psyche is something of Orwell's opposite, where she's very aware of who and what she is. She is not self-obsessed with anything to do with her appearance and seems to almost be like
aloof,
blissfully unaware of the fact that she's externally beautiful and is just comfortable with the fact that she's a person who loves to be alive. Like she's happy with being here. She loves what she has, even if it's not optimal. She loves what she has. She loves those around her. She's someone that's very likable. She is very attractive. She's very beautiful. In the original telling of the myth, from what I remember, she's basically someone who is so beautiful that she couldn't even get suitors because the men were afraid to be attracted to her because they figured her to be something like a demigod or deity. Right. Yep. And so Lewis plays off that idea in the story. It's not quite as explicit as, she has no suitors. And so we have this problem, but she definitely receives attention that is, let's say, perhaps due or undue. This is something that I'm willing to kind of toss around with you guys and see what we want to do with that. Because do you think that it was utterly unlawful for the people to treat her in a way that elevated her above everyone else? Or was that in some sense an ordinate reaction to her beauty?
I think if we're only taking this story in mind and not C.S. Lewis' other works like The Weight of Glory, then I think that you could make an argument that it was undue. But if we're to take The Weight of Glory and the argument that he makes in there about every creature, every single human that you interact with is on the path to being on the path of theosis or on the path to being demonized, and our interactions with each other spur people one direction or the other. There's no neutral state. And I think that this, like what you said, Sean, about her being the opposite of Psyche, being the opposite of Orwell, is that you see this Orwell, this creature that is kind of faceless and neutral. So this is the other side, another layer that we just talked about how ugly she was, but in the majority of the story, she's faceless. She doesn't have a face. She doesn't know her face. Like you said before, she's completely disconnected from who she actually is. And that's the arc of her story, is knowing this, knowing herself. But I think what C.S. Lewis is trying to highlight here is that with what true beauty is, because yes, externally Psyche was beautiful, but when you're talking about the soul of Psyche, her name Psyche means soul, her soul was beautiful. The external expression of her soul, or her being beautiful, is because inside she was beautiful. She didn't use her beauty as a tool. She didn't use the love of other people for her as a tool to manipulate. She was beautiful inside, and that in this fictional story is being expressed externally. So if, like what C.S. Lewis says, that if you met them and they have been gone through theosis, you'd be tempted to worship. I think that the veneration that she received may have gone too far. That's part of the story of the jealousy between her and Ungit. But I do think that we should be seeing the image of God in those around us. And I think that her treating others with that level of respect, at her own detriment, walking out in the midst of everybody with the plague, to even give some menial comfort was an act of, but you're important too. That selfless, right? Which is something that Orwell could not be at that moment.
And I think it's really interesting too that there's the three kind of archetypal positions of beauty in the story, and they're all very revelatory, right? Where
Mhm.
you have Orwell, who is an ugly face with an ugly heart. You have Psyche, who's a beautiful face with a beautiful heart, and you have Redeval right in the middle, who is a beautiful face with an ugly heart, right? And so she's this kind of mixture, right?
Yeah.
She's this like the opposite of both of them almost, right?
Mm.
But you have all three represented rather explicitly through the three sisters. And so in the story, the way that this kind of builds up is that you have Psyche, who's not jealous of anyone really. Like she's there, and she's a good sister, she's a good daughter, she's a good community member, she's a good leader, she's a good example, right? But she's also not in any way like corrupted by the kind of attention that she's getting. In fact, in some sense, she was like, why should I make a big deal of this? You know what I mean?
She didn't
And it
take
was
it to herself.
everybody else. Yeah, everybody else was making a big deal of it, and she's just like, well, no, I mean, this happened before. They're like, how many times? She's, I don't know, lots of times. Like, why is this a did I do something? Can I fix this? Is it my fault? She's ready to take responsibility like that. You know what I mean? And so it's just a really interesting contrast that you have. Like you said, it's not, beautiful here, but then manipulative and self-serving here. Not like Redeval is, right? Like Redeval's ready to become a chameleon for anything that benefits her, especially if it gets her a man. You know what I mean? And Psyche is again an opposite. You know what I mean? She's just this backward. I saw you unmute, Sean. Sorry, I didn't mean to step on your toes.
No, you're fine. No, I was just thinking about the question that you asked, whether or not it was do or undo. I almost see Psyche as like a glorified human, right? Like just born perfect. And if you have someone who is, like a glorified human in a world where there are gods, I mean, she was basically already born a god, right? And I think that the people quickly recognized that, and they wanted to worship her as a god. And then, of course, we know even after she had crossed her river, people started worshiping her as a god, and so you had the god Istra. So yeah, I don't know. I think I could see the reason why they would do that in a world where there are gods that regularly interact with people. She definitely seemed to be one, and so much so that the god of the mountain wanted to take her as a bride. So it's, he obviously saw something in her.
So I think at this point we should expound upon what the original story was, as opposed to this additional content that Lewis is bringing in by introducing in the original story what would have been a tangential character or a device for the story is now the central focus of the story. So the initial story, and correct me if I'm missing anything here, Troy, but the initial story is basically that there was three sisters in a kingdom. The youngest sister is the most beautiful woman basically in the entire world. She's just impossibly beautiful and is inspiring awe and veneration in everyone. She's so beautiful that the men are afraid to become her suitors. And so her father is incapable of finding somebody who's going to marry this daughter and merge the kingdom. But the other two daughters are kind of like unsuitable, right? In some sense that makes them like I can't say that there's anything that I remember specifically about the story that would make the father want to skip over the first two, other than that the first one is ugly and the second one is kind of.
And in the original story, the daughters aren't considered ugly, or they're not ugly. They're just
Okay.
they pale in comparison to Psyche. and that
Okay, so maybe I'm
it's
thinking
their-
about a contrast rather than like
Yeah,
any description or whatever.
it's
Yeah.
their jealousy of Psyche that makes them ugly. And the
Ah, yeah, okay.
suitor, yeah, so it's not this, it's, I don't necessarily think that he had a problem with suitors for the other two. It was that he had a problem with suitors for Psyche. And when it came to, um, and maybe there was problems with suitors for the other two, and that Psyche's beauty kept people away from all three of them. And so the father goes to the oracle and says, what do I do about Psyche? I want her to have a suitor. And she goes, there's no man that will suit her. So what you need to do is take her to the edge of a cliff and turn her over to a dragon, a dragon god, and he will devour her and marry her. And so the daughters, rife with jealousy, convince their father this is the right thing to do. So they sacrifice Psyche. Um, the West Wind, on behalf of Cupid, picks her up, brings her to the palace, his palace. Um, she doesn't see any of the servants, but the servants say, "Hey, this is your house. You're the lady of this house. Your your suitor will be here this evening." And so, in the process of her getting used to her new house, she meets the suitor in the dark, and he says, "This is the one thing. This is the only thing that I ask of you, is that you don't ask who I am and you don't see my face." And so, in the midst of that, you have the her saddened by not being able to see her face, and one of her requests is to see her sisters. In the process of seeing her sisters, the sisters convince her that he's a beast and a monster, and that it's not right that he um, stays in the dark. So what she needs to do is take a lamp and a knife, cover the lamp, walk up into his room, uncover the lamp, see the monster that he is, and then kill him while he sleeps. And so she climbs, goes to the room, uncovers the lamp, is met with Cupid, is completely overtaken by how absolutely gorgeous this god is, but a godly beauty, something that makes her beauty even pale in comparison, scares her. Like, how can a mortal be with an immortal? And while she's gazing in love, now in responsive love, a a drop of hot oil drips on Cupid, wakes him up, and he feels betrayed, leaves her, and then she tries to kill herself, but is not completely harmed, and then ends up going to, I think it's Athena. I could be wrong, but God of Wisdom, and asks, "What do I need to do to repent? How do I get back to Cupid?" And she gives her three unmanageable, impossible tasks of sorting a pile of grain in a night into its various different piles, of getting the fleece from the rams of the gods, and at each, and then the final one is going to the goddess of the underworld and getting a drop of her beauty to bring it back. Um, and each of those, she's given divine help. Um, when it comes to sorting of the grains, ants show up and help her sort the grains, so she meets it in a night. When it comes to the rams run off, and the god of the river gives her a clue and says, "Hey, go to the thicket and pull the fleece from that's been ripped off as they ran through the thicket." So she gets that. And then in the third one, it's, maybe I got that wrong. She has to get water, the living water from at living water from the source of the Styx, which is somewhat of an underworld story. And she gets to the mountain through a desert that's burning her the whole time. And then when she gets to the mountain, she realizes it's completely covered in snakes and scorpions, and that the mountain is a torturous event. She doesn't know what to do. And an eagle shows up, fills it up with water, gives it back to her. And then the final thing is going to get a drop of her beauty. She gets the drop of the goddess of the underworld's beauty. Her curiosity overcomes her. She opens the box. The beauty of the gods is too strong for her and incapacitates her. By this time, Cupid learns about all the work that she's done, sees her, brings her back to life, gives her ambrosia, the food of the gods, and she becomes immortal and becomes the fresh god. So that's the original story. Sean, I think I've got all the details. What do you think?
Yeah. I mean, like Deborah said in the chat, it was Venus, and
Oh, Venus.
Venus is Cupid's mom, and so Venus obviously hated her for her beauty, and in fact wanted to send Cupid to strike her with an arrow, so that way she would just love, what was it, like the most basest of humans.
Yes. Yes.
And instead, he fell madly in love with her, and so that's when he got the West Wind to take her to his place. And yeah, so she had those 4 trials, and of course, along the way, like you said, she had the eagle to help with the water. She had, I think it was a reed that told her about the golden fleece, and then ants that helped her with the sifting of the grain. And I believe when she went to go get the beauty of Persephone, which I think when she's in Hades it's Persephone, on Earth it's Cora, I think. But yeah, she went to go get the beauty, and it was actually given to her by the queen of the underworld. So everybody helped her along the way, and then she opens the beauty, ends up getting punished again, and it wasn't until Cupid went and asked
Zeus.
went to ask Zeus if she could become a goddess, and once she was made a goddess, then everyone lived together happily. So yeah, there's that. You got to become more than what you are in order to belong to the family of the gods.
Yes. Okay, so with the groundwork laid, with that framework, let's say the most relevant portion of the story for what we're talking about in Till We Have Faces is in fact the first half of the story, where Psyche is chosen by in this story, all of the gods and goddesses are renamed because Lewis is brilliant and is trying to, retexture the story in a really authentic way. And so instead of Venus and Cupid, it's Ungit and let's say the beast, and I forget the other name that they give to Cupid in the story. I think they conflate him with West Wind, and they're like it's basically one and the same character.
God of the mountain is the
God of the mountain.
Yeah,
and
so they still have the West Wind.
So it was the god of the mountain and Ungit is jealous of Psyche for receiving the veneration for beauty from the people, and the people even begin to sacrifice to her. And so there's this kind of like, they're treating her as more than a human, right? And the goddess takes a notice, gets upset with it, and by way of the priest of her temple instructs the king that someone there's evil afoot in the camp, and it needs to be weeded out, is kind of how it's introduced, that there's a curse upon the people and it's going to bring evil unto the people, right? And then there's a sickness that begins to spread, and instead of being a curse unto the people, Psyche then goes out and begins to do things to try to help everyone, right? And in so doing, she kind of has this experience that almost funny enough, we get a telling of it from the Green Goblin to Spider-Man. You live long enough to see yourself become the villain, right? Like everybody is going to turn on you. They want to see a good hero fall, right? And so everybody begins to turn on Psyche, and the same people who are coming to her asking for her help and blessing are now turning on her and blaming her and pointing the finger. And they all come together in a very mob-like fashion. If you want to know about some of the themes behind a mob that comes for people in that way, we did an episode on the narrative themes of zombies and went over some of these things in greater depth. But they all turn on her, and they begin to enact this kind of, they're under the guidance or almost the enchanted spell of something that is directly opposed to Psyche and wants to damage her. So they leave her on the mountain. She's not taken necessarily in this version. She's taken by the people in a procession to be a sacrifice, and they're going to leave her for the beast. And they believe, and there's this really interesting contrast and pairing between the idea of leaving her for the beast to be devoured, and the idea of her being bound or wed to the god of the mountain, and how those two things kind of come together. This is something that I think is one of the most deeply Christian motifs that Lewis was trying to play with in this story, is the idea of consumption and covenant, like union, right? That's one of the things that I think is kind of where the sap is in a story like this. I'm sorry, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I think that, well, we haven't talked about the fox. And so one of the things that he does a lot in this story is he has the fox is a stand-in for Greek wisdom. And you have the priest of Unget that stands in for the pagan wisdom. And so those are always in conflict in the story. And so with this specific one, you have the Greek wisdom, materialistic perspective, kind of pushing back and going, how can the devouring and the marriage be the same thing? How can it be the most vile of creatures that you offer, but also the most pure of creatures? How can it be both? And so you have this, the priest's response in that is going, that's Greek wisdom and you're a slave here. This is the way that we view things, that the devouring and the marriage are the same, that the greatest of offering is not good enough, and that this call for the sacrifice is one that has offended the gods in the worst way possible. So it's like they just deal with the mystery, the paradox there, and the Greek mind, the fox, is trying to go, this makes no sense. This makes no sense. And so you have that contrast back and forth. That's what leads them to the mountain. She gets left there, the west wind, and then they leave. She just is left there tied to a tree and iron shackles and can't get out. So where else do you want to go on that? Sorry.
I was going to say, so then the kind of mystery contrast that's happening here is this, like, the unity or the conflation, this like the comparison, let's say, between the consuming and the unifying or marrying, the covenant, right? And so we have, and this is one of the stronger themes of our New Testament, is in fact that our God is a consuming fire, but like the burning bush, we burn brightly but not burn away, right? Like that we are then in this consumption unified to God, and he in some sense feeds on the people that unify themselves to him. And in the same way, well, perhaps not in the same way, but in direct relation to this, Christ himself offers us through the Eucharist a way that we can consume him back, and this no longer be something that's simply parasitic or something like that. And again, another callback to a previous Cosmic Corner episode where we talked about vampirism and the idea of consuming someone, yep, or being consumed by something or someone, and right, the idea that the symbolism of consuming or eating is actually much deeper than simply being nourished by something. It's in fact to become something, right? That what you eat becomes you, right? And what eats you integrates you into itself, right? And so there's this, like, in some sense, being left there as a sacrifice to be consumed by this beast is actually the same thing as leaving her to be unified with deity, right? Like, are you guys, because this, I'm still trying to form the idea coherently in my head. Do you guys see what I'm saying? Like, she's in being left, not just being left to the fact that this beast is going to consume her. Now she's dead. That's the end of it. There's actually this other half of it where, because we don't know what is actually in the mountain, we don't know the thing. in our ignorance is something, again, of a hiding or a veiling, and that veil is something that later on becomes not a hiding, but actually a revelation. So it's like the veils that we see throughout the story are both a means of hiding and a means of revelation.
So can I see if I can wrestle with your idea a little bit?
Yeah.
You have multiple definitions, multiple perspectives being expressed by C.S. Lewis about what is happening in that moment, right? And I think that based on the worshippers of Ungut and the priest of Ungut, the devouring has that paradox built into it, that it's either a devouring or it's both a devouring and a marriage. You have the fox's perspective that this is just barbaric. Okay. So I think that you have, from a human perspective, the consumption is being consumed. But I think from the God's perspective, which you get later in the story, to be consumed and to consume is to be transformed, right? And so maybe that's what you're talking about with the connection to the Eucharist, is that in consuming Christ, we become transformed into the body of Christ, his bride, one flesh, right? And that it's not that I lose my identity in being consumed by Christ. It's that my identity is integrated. I remain Troy, you remain Sean, you remain Josh, but we make up the body of Christ, and that I have a part to play, you have a part to play, Sean has a part to play. And so we're integrated into the body of Christ as we consume on Christ and as he integrates us into his body. So is that where you were aiming at? I was hoping that I'm getting what you're putting down.
Yeah.
Could I put a finer point on it?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. So consuming is just the assimilation of resources, right? So when we eat, we are taking resources from our environment and we are making them a part of our body. If we knew nothing else about what happened to Psyche on the mountain, we knew that Orwell and Bardia wanted to go and search for her bones so that they could bury her. So the consumption meant she is now part of the mountain. So wherever she is in the mountain. The consuming means that she is now part of something greater. She doesn't stop being herself, but she gets assimilated into that greater thing. And so we can see that with the marriage and the palace, and she's on the other side of the river. She's no longer in our world, but she's in their world, but she's more herself than she was over here. But those have implications also for the Eucharist, right? It also has implications for the opposite of the Eucharist, which is when, and I don't want to get too far ahead, but when we seek to love somebody in our own context, it's only because we see something beautiful in them and we want to have that for ourselves. And so we want to break them down and strip them of those beautiful things and assimilate that into our context. So you only get to be you when it's for me.
Oh my gosh.
So anyway, I'll let
so this, what you just said brings another light to Orwell. Psyche was mine, right? That's the thing that she says multiple times. Psyche was mine. Why? Because she's my beauty. And she doesn't want to let Psyche go, and she blames the gods and is bitter the entire time because the gods took her beauty. What she was trying to break down and integrate to herself, she's mine. She's an extension of me. I raised her like a mother. And there's once again, it's at the end of the book where we're talking about now, is that her complaint is just repeated over and over again. You took what's mine. Not seeing that Psyche is an individual, an entity of herself. And like you said, once she crosses that river, once the west wind moves her into that, she's now across that river and she's more herself and more godlike than she has ever been before. And she's more queen-like than she's ever been before. And she stands up to Orwell. Not that Orwell ever needed her to stand up to her before, but when Orwell takes a wrong turn into jealousy, takes a wrong turn into, jealousy is I guess the right word for it. I guess that's the point of the story. Psyche actually stands up against that and says, no, that's just like she would say, well, did I do something wrong? She's just more herself in that regard. So yeah, that makes a whole lot more sense when you're talking about in the consuming. I just want to break down, and that attribute of you I want to be mine, and you become an extension of me, because that thing that I don't have, you have, and I want to use you so that I have that you become an extension of me, and now I have that attribute of whatever it may be. And so up to this point, Psyche had been an attribute of beauty that Orwell was missing. That's another wonderful layer that that's awesome. Thanks.
Well done, St. John.
And then that was also part of her complaint is so what if you took her to make her happy? What business do you have of giving her something good that I didn't give her? Like,
yep.
It's my job to give it to her. Like she says earlier in the book, I wish that I could have been a man, that I could have married her, so then she would have been my wife. I wish I could have been like a lord, so that way I could have freed her, because she wants only those things. She wants all of the qualities of Psyche to be indebted to her.
Yes.
So then by like the visual equivalency here, Psyche plays the role of her first veil. That was the thing that Orwell is actually hiding her character behind so that she can continue this performance, which makes sense that only after Psyche is gone that she wears a veil permanently.
Yep.
Right.
Oh,
so those
wow. I didn't think
things tie in directly.
I didn't think about this, but as you say that, it wasn't until after she left and she started wearing the veil that she said that people were commenting that the reason she wore a veil was because she was a radiant beauty behind the veil and she didn't want other. So it's like that. You're right. That was her mask. And so by putting on the veil, it's almost like she's putting on Psyche.
And I know that we've all seen, or we've all experienced, and even in movies seen the idea of, let's say, the aspiring younger sibling who looks up to their older sibling, and everything that they do is like, oh, well, this person's my older brother, so and it like that becomes their entire identity. That becomes the entire expression of who they are, is, oh, I'm this person's this thing. This is my whole shtick is to be connected to this person. This is my identity.
I just had this thought, and maybe this is too on the nose, but I said her putting on the veil is putting on Psyche. And then you remember when she went to the priest of Istrel and she sees the idol of Istrel and it's wearing a veil, and they only take the veil, and it's like, dude, okay.
They mix the two together. Yeah. Oh my gosh.
Crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so this is why I was excited at the beginning, y'all, that I knew that all these smiling connections were going to start popping off at some point. So the interesting thing here is that when Psyche is being handed over as a sacrifice, Orwell does have genuine concern, but it's all mixed in with really improper motives, right? And so you get this. As far as Orwell is concerned, all of her motives are attached to her concern, right? Which is why I say that she has this abject lack of awareness of herself. She has this striking honesty about herself in a lot of parts of the book where she says, you might think that I was wrong, but this is where I was. This is what I like. That's where I was at, right? And she has these moments of honesty and clarity, but they're always as an appeal towards something that would excuse her rather than an admission that would bring about something like repentance or transformation toward anything positive. There are always more reasons why you should feel sorry for her because of what she's experiencing, which is in fact what she's doing to herself. Right. And so a lot of her pain in the book is self-inflicted, right? And a lot of the pain in the book that isn't self-inflicted is inflicted by self on the other, right? And so she seems to be the source of the conflict, and in her mind she's supposed to be something like the resolution of the conflict for Psyche. Like you said, Sean, she's not supposed to receive these things from some dark thing on the mountain that I don't know? Why should she be happy with this dark thing on the mountain? Let me construct an entire narrative for myself as to why this is wrong. Yeah, I have that sneaking suspicion in the background that I'm probably wrong and I should mind my own business. But no, she is my business. This is my psyche. There's just this really interesting, like I said, moments of honest reflection that are completely glossed over or even blindfolded against because she has this insistence that it is all hers. She's just everything that she does is like a black hole. She's just absorbing and trying to suck in everything. She is the like Deborah said, she is the devouring mother. Her love is consumption, right?
Yep. And she comes to that realization too, that she says, I have gorged on other men's lives.
Yes, exactly.
One of the most jarring points in the book is in the complaint where she says, you gods said that the brute would devour her. Well, why didn't it? Like, I would have buried her bones and built a shrine for her. You had no right to take her from me. Like,
and to glorify her.
Yeah, he's like, I would rather have her dead and mine than to be happy in yours.
Yep.
That's crazy.
Exactly. And so in that sense, when you look at, and when you stare it in the face, like you just laid it out, is like, is that love or is that some sort of ugly cousin to lust?
Well, the way that the fox says is when he finds out how she pushed Psyche with the, stabbing her own arm. He goes that your love is 9/10 hatred. Being able to say, like, you might, there might be a core of love there, but the way you've gone about it, you don't use someone else's love for you, manipulate them into moving, right? And the fox is given an opportunity to do that as well, and he goes, I won't do that to you, right? I'm not going to use your love for me to manipulate you into doing something else, right? And so there's not what what does the fox say? That's awesome. Read the book because he's got a lot of things to say, and even he has a moment of repentance. But yeah, that's where I think that you're talking about is like, what is it when love is more hatred than love? What is love when it's more jealousy than love? It may start somewhere healthy, or may start somewhere innocent, but when you've got, like the fox says, 9/10 hatred mixed in with your love, something's wrong.
And the book really challenges me on a few points. One of them being toward the end there at the mural. Orwell says, and we did all this and we said that we loved her. And the fox says, and we did. And so there's a sense in which, love can be ugly. And it's not that it's not love. It's that it is love, but it's in a wrong context, or it's a wrong kind of love, or it's a self-centered love.
Mm-hmm.
But the other thing that challenges me is Orwell is painted as such a flawed human being, right? But yet she's so honest, so competent, so resourceful.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like, in a sense, we can look at her and be like, man, why couldn't you figure it out? And on this other sense, it's like, man, I would aspire to be like her. And so that challenges me. And it also is maybe a warning that this kind of self-deception isn't just for fools. Like, you could be self-deceived and be a very competent person.
Yeah. This is what I was talking about at the very beginning when I said it's like a mirror. When you're reading it, and the more that you read it, and the more that you go, that you're looking at her competencies and looking at her failures, and can I really look at her and throw a stone and say, with all of that competency, with all of the wisdom that you garnered over the years, how are you so self-deceived? And there's moments where the Holy Spirit is like, this, and I'm like, yeah. I'm standing before the mirror too, and I'm going, oh yeah, I'm ungit. But there's moments later where, when I turn over, when I repent, when I even in the attempt, like the ants, or her being the distraction for the rams, or her being the one that bears the heat of the sun on the way to the mountain to get the water, or in these various different paths, being going, oh, I get to participate in Psyche as well. So I'm not just Ungit, I'm not just the jealous, I'm not just the hateful and the ugly, but I also have access to being beautiful and um of great character and wisdom and many other things. So it's like this contrast of none of us are single facet. None of us are just the good or just the bad. All of us are what is who said it? The line between good and evil runs between the heart of every man. That's the reality that C.S. Lewis is wrestling with Orwell, is that she is a mirror of every human, and that she's faceless for a reason, because my face goes there. you know
Right. And there's something interesting also in the fact that, like, when you look at the overall flow of the story and her kind of this selfish reactionary kind of impulse that she has when she's going against Psyche, when she sees Psyche for the first time alive, and she's so happy that she's alive, and then Psyche is sweet and she's kind and she's inviting, she's doing all these things, and then she begins to talk about this remarkable enchanted thing that she's been given, right? And Lewis's remarkable and brilliant addition to this is that Orwell is blind.
Mhm.
She not only doesn't have a face, she doesn't even have eyes. She has no eyes to see. She has no ears to hear. The spiritual reality that Psyche is participating in is completely gone to Orwell. It is not there at all. And so when Psyche begins to describe the magnificence of the castle, the remarkable wine, this is my favorite goblet, it's for you, right? And Orwell thinks, okay, she just scooped water out of the stream with her own hands to let me drink it. Yes, give me your hands. This is also my favorite cup, my beloved, right? She thinks that Psyche is giving herself back to her because that's all she can see, because that's all she expects. That's all she desires. And so she only sees what she wants to see, right?
In the final notes of the book, C.S. Lewis covers that's the main thing that he changed. Is in the original, the sisters can see the castle, can see, they visit, they see all of it, and their jealousy is based on what they see, right? And in this one, he changes it so that Orwell is blind to it. Like, she gets glimpses and she gets interactions with the gods, but in reality, she's willfully blind to it. That she only sees the thing that she desires and doesn't see anything else.
Right.
So my mind just exploded real quick because as you're talking about these things that she can't see, and the water and the stuff like that, where she's just blind to it, but there's a real reality behind it. I'm thinking of sacraments, right? Things that we can't see, but we trust in faith. And then you said she thought that she was giving herself back to her, and this is like an inversion, because in the Eucharist, when we see these other elements, what we're actually getting is him. He is giving himself to us. And so, like, all the best things that Orwell could have hoped for, that's actually present to us there.
Yeah. And that reminds me of kind of how the disciples, when Jesus is talking about, hey, I've got to die so that the Holy Spirit can come, and some other things, their response is, no, we have you here. That's what we want, right? You're here. We don't want you to go anywhere. This is how we want it to be. And he's like, no, you realize that if I go away, something greater is going to happen. You're going to be participating in something much greater than me localized like this. And I think that you see the same thing. I love that you tied that to the Eucharist, is that now Christ is not localized per se. He's localized in each and every single one of us. Right? So he's not only localized, but he's also universal. And but you have to be selfless to see it that way. If you're selfish, you're going, so this is what I get back, right? A piece of bread and a little wine. this is what I get back. And instead of going, go ahead.
I was going to say that blindness is also really profound in a way that it kind of illustrates something of the point of, I think, like Romans 1, where you have enough of a glimpse from everything around you to be accountable, but you don't have so much explicit display that you have no choice in the matter, right? Like Orwell is given glimpses, like you said, she's given sufficient awareness that she should be second guessing herself far more than she does. She even admits in the narrative that she knows and sees that the gods are going to point this out later and say, you should have known, you did know, you chose not to know. Right. And so when scripture, talks about those who darken their own eyes, we harden our hearts toward things and things like that. This is exactly the kind of language and display that Lewis is kind of playing with here, and the way that she's electing to veil what should be revealed. Like this is not, she's putting a veil over something that's already been revealed. There's no reason why she shouldn't believe Psyche.
She's masking what has been veiled. As in, veils normally have a two-way. They block some view, but it allows for transfer between. Whereas she's masking it. There's a hard barrier between what has been revealed and what she's willing to accept. So willful blindness.
And she's using Fox's logic here of, well, it's obviously this, so it can't be this. But then in the story, she says Ungit has no face, and therefore she has 1,000 faces. So she's able to see the dichotomy there, right? Where they're both true. But in nothing else is she able to do that. And that's one of the things that Fox most repents for is, I taught her this. And
fed her on words.
Yeah, fed her on words.
Yeah.
Well, what best displays the vampiric narcissist than the fact that they can't see their own reflection? She can see evil everywhere except in the mirror. Right? Like it's almost
so she's forced to.
Yeah, so to use some rather Protestant language, she's imputing her evil onto the world and pretending like it's everywhere else and it's not in here. It's not in you. My love for Psyche is pure. It's the only pure thing I have, you see, is this thing. Because Psyche ceases to be a person in some sense once she begins to be taken away and she's left, and Orwell decides that she's going to go up there and retrieve whatever remains there happen to be to try to be honorable toward this person. Once she finds out that she's alive, she's happy. Once she finds out that she's happy, she'd rather her be dead. Right. And it's like, how dare you be pleased without me? This reminds me deeply of another of the Great Divorce. There's so many elements of this story that are reflected in the episodic little discussions that are in the Great Divorce. This is another wonderful book that perhaps we'll do one of these discussions on. I would really love to do that. But this reminds me specifically of the doting mother in the Great Divorce, who is like, has just taken a bus ride from hell to heaven, is in this place, realizes that she's not even real enough to reside in this place unless she goes toward the mountain. And she says, that mountain repulses me because the one up there, the god of the mountain, has taken from me the thing that I wanted most. How dare you? I don't believe in a god that would take a son from a mother. How dare give him back to me. I'll take him with me. She would rather her son go to hell than be in holiness and completeness and happiness. It is identical, this drive, and it's like it really is like, it reminds me very much of a vampiric, I can't see myself. That's why I'm convinced that this is why a vampire has no reflection, is that there's no way for it to view itself as such. There's no way. And so and not only is she unwilling to view herself, later she makes it impossible to view herself by physically covering her appearance, right? And using this as a strength against others and a weakness against herself, right? She knows that she's not the great queen that she's embodying. She's doing something that is beyond herself. But what is left inside, because it's taking backstage to this performance, is withering away. Orwell becomes less and less, right?
Yep.
And it's almost the opposite of the discipleship experience that we have, that Christ would become more and I would become lesser, right? It's the opposite of that. It's like I would feign Christ enough that the person that I should be submitting simply kind of withers back into the corner, and the performance becomes the real thing. Right. And it's like, I think this is what Christ might have been talking about in some sense when he says, many will say, Lord, Lord, didn't we do these things in your name, and so forth. And he says, I never knew you. There was nothing that made the authenticity of their relationship. It was simply performance art. It was the same thing. They're playing a character. They're playing a role. Hypocrisy, exactly. They're putting on a mask, right? Which is where that word comes from. And I don't remember exactly how it's rendered in the Greek, but the word for hypocrisy is ultimately to put on a mask and make a show of things. It's not, it's the opposite of the authenticity, right? And so when she makes this decision, and I think it is the decision to betray Psyche through manipulation, when she does that, she no longer can have this reflection. It's intolerable for her. That's the thing that would, let's say, burn her bones in some sense, is to really look at the thing and say, this is what you've done. And you know that it's what you've done.
Yep.
And you suppress the truth in unrighteousness.
Wow.
Because you know.
Okay, so if I could draw a line from that to, like you said, vampires, they don't have a reflection because they can't look at themselves. If they were to look at themselves, they would have to reform their behavior because they couldn't do that. And then I take that to Jesus saying, I speak in parables lest they would understand and repent, and I would forgive them.
Yep.
So you have this, they would reform if I showed them who they are, but I'm going to give them these parables that they won't be able to interpret if they don't want to.
Right.
Because otherwise they would have to confront what they are, realize that they're wicked, and they would repent, and I would forgive them.
Right. It requires the willingness to see yourself in the mirror, and they're unwilling to, so they don't.
Yeah.
Wow. That's really good.
So then the second visit, let's say up the mountain, when she comes back to Psyche and is insisting that Psyche betray the god of the mountain, right? And then does this manipulative scheme where, well, like Troy, you alluded to it. She brings a dagger with her and she uses self-harm. And Psyche even says to her explicitly, your threat to kill me doesn't mean anything because I love you. Right. And this should have been, I think that should have been the moment of wake up call for Arwell. If she was actually the loving mother-like figure that she said that she was being, it would have been to see that Psyche was still in a position to honor and love her. Right. But was instead, like, I'm not going to sacrifice the goodness of what's actually happening for this figurative lie that you're making up about the situation. You're the one that's lying here. And you won't believe me. What have I done that makes you think that I'm a liar, or that I'm somehow unsane, or that I'm being tortured or neglected? She says, look at me. Psyche invites her to make an assessment objectively of the situation and say, does it look like I'm wasting away in the woods with some god-awful beast? Does it appear this way? Use your reason. Use your eyes. If you can't see the spiritual things, at least perceive the physical things. Do you not see what's in front of you? That I'm not being mistreated. I haven't been neglected. In fact, I'm stronger than you now. And I've been living in the woods off of stream water. Really? Really? Like, I was tied to a tree and left for dead. You come back up here. Not only am I not dead, I'm now more alive. Right? And if I'm more alive now than I was when they abandoned me, and you come up here and you try to strong arm me into abandoning the thing that I am now. And she has this honor about her where she's like, no, I am a wife now. I've experienced a transformation that you and your pity don't get to take away.
Yep.
You don't get to do that. And
you
it's
don't get
not
to command me.
Exactly. It's not about you. What you're trying to do is take away the reality of what's taken place and pretend like nothing happened. You know what I mean? Like, and this is something that I think is really interesting. You have like Orwell wants to pretend away the thing. And she's accusing Psyche of the one doing the pretending. You know what I mean? And so I think that this is something that I've seen also in the apologetics world. There's this cynicism that runs rampant in the mind of the internet atheist that thinks that the Christian is just doing some sort of pretending your anguish and fear of death away by leaning on this crutch that we call religion, right? And you're pretending it away. You know, come on, see reason. Don't you know that your flying spaghetti monster doesn't actually exist? There's no castle, Psyche. There's no castle. There's no servants. There's no wine. There is no goblet. It was your hand in a stream. And the atheist, for all of their, desire to be factually correct, is the one doing the pretending away, right? And they're being, again, willfully blind. And perhaps at this point in their cynicism, it's no longer willful. They're simply blind. But that doesn't mean it didn't begin as willful. And I think that's really kind of the emphasis that Lewis wanted to put on display, is that there were glimpses given.
Yes.
But her blindness was elected.
Yep.
She chose to gouge her own spiritual eyes out for the sake of being able to be embittered and resentful against Psyche and the gods.
Yep.
And it was in order to maintain this. And then once you do that, and you build up this construct of what you think the narrative of your life is, to rip up the web of everything and just start over is so costly. It's so costly. And we do this all the time individually, but in the way that he can kind of thematically work it into a narrative that's so honest. It's like your sin will often be its own punishment, right? But also the thing that she did in sinning against Psyche and creating all the turmoil of Psyche's life, the way that she ends up in some sense reconciling or atoning for this is, in fact, like you said before, participating in that hardship with Psyche, right? And she's doing this because she wants to pursue Psyche because she still wants her, right? But the divine mind behind the scenario that's interworking and interweaving in the scripture, it says that God works all things for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose, right? So in the backdrop, we know that God is constantly at work doing things that we ourselves don't really have the apparatus to behold, right? We just don't. Right. And I can't see what God is doing until long afterward, when I can, in retrospect, look backwards and see what has taken place and recognize God's fingerprints on everything. Right. And so it's interesting that the role that Orwell plays in the first half of the book is the suffering of Psyche. And in the second half of the book, she plays the suffering of Psyche. Right. But not in a causal sense, but in an experiential sense. She now gets to actually embody the suffering of Psyche, and Psyche then gets to move along through these different impossible tasks by way of the suffering that's being passed off onto Orwell. She's absorbing for herself all of the turmoil that she brought about. She then gets to experience in the stead of Psyche, right? And so it's like in some really weird backdoor sense, justice is served, right? But it also is veiled. Like, you just don't see it until it's made plain for you later that this is what was taking place. That, it's not like Orwell was being explicitly punished. She was in a pursuit, but it's at the same time, it was her wretchedness that was driving her, but she didn't know that it was also in some sense being used as a tool to purify out of her.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's what you said about what the gods, or the wisdom behind the labors that she went into later, is working out that hatred out of her love, to work out the jealousy out of her love, to work out the consuming mother perspective, or consuming mother, the way that she's approaching Psyche, is to work that out of her. She had to die before she died, right? And then there's that statement when she makes that betrayal from the god that says, "You also shall be Psyche," is going, right, you're Unget, but you also shall be Psyche. Is that, all right, what works are you going to do? Are you going to do the works of Ungit and devour men and devour people and operate in jealousy? Or are you going to be Psyche that's honest, truthful, beautiful, and of high character? And I think that, the labors that she goes through is that the slow her being changed into something that is better, changed into the character of Psyche. And you see that nearer and nearer the end. And she becomes more honest with herself, where she's going, well, I see that I'm Ungit, where she has the vision in the clay pillar room, and she sees herself in the mirror from the ghost of her father, who forces her to see it again. And she makes the proclamation that she's Ungit. From that point forward, she goes, well, maybe I can change that and try to do something just, try to be this way. And she was like, I'd go about it, and within 30 minutes, I was in another one of my rages, another one of my jealousies, another one of my faults. I just couldn't do it. But then she goes, but the people say that these were the best judgments I'd ever given. My dooms were the best at this point. So it's like she is making labor and she is making progress, but she doesn't see that either.
And I mean, I can say that in my own experience, even in a Christian walk, that it took me a minute to not only see, but actually accept the fact that I'm like, the fruit that I produce is not for me. It's for everyone else.
Mm-hmm.
Right. The good fruit of what I'm doing is never me. I don't reap the fruit of my own tree. I'm blessed by others. I'm called to be a blessing to others. And so my good fruit is for others. Right. And so even if I don't recognize, and this is something that I think perhaps should be more readily said in Christian circles, it is not your business to wonder if your fruit tastes good. It is your business to produce good fruit, right? And so what you should be doing is striving for production rather than striving to get a satisfied sense of certainty that your fruit is the best, right? Like I don't need to be assured constantly anymore that I am participating in what Christ has for me, right? Because I've come to see that all of the things that I was looking for as a signpost and an affirmation were actually never for me in the first place. It wasn't actually for me to produce fruit so that I can prove to myself that I'm a fruit producer, right? That's not what the fruit is for. The fruit is actually for everyone else to be blessed and called into the same, right? And so you have this kind of like the way that she doesn't notice that what she's doing when she's trying to do good, and she's judging herself so harshly that she's blind to the good that it's actually doing. She has to be told by others that it was actually good. It's the same way as like I'm my own worst critic, and I'll listen back to some of these conversations and be like, man, I could have said that better. And then other people are like, man, that was amazing. And they give you a nickname like Golden Lips, and you're like, yeah, okay. And then like they think, okay, this is a gift. God's using you for something. It's like, well, I don't see it. Well, good for you. You're not supposed to. It's not for you. It's not for you. The blessing is external. It's for the other. You know what I mean? And so in the same way, I think she's going through a process of, let's say, like hard knock life sanctification that she's kind of participating in on purpose, but she doesn't notice it because it's this arduous and painful, and I'm keep falling back into this thing. Why do I keep falling back into this thing? Hello, temptation, right? I recently preached a sermon about temptation, and the thing that I was trying my hardest to make the revelation of that sermon was that in our temptations, even when we fail, it's the fact that we don't stay down, or the fact that we're engaging willfully, and we're chained. The scripture says God gives us ways of escape. We take those ways of escape, and those temptation moments then become the greatest moments of transformation in our walk. They're no longer just the inconvenience of being tempted and tested and feeling guilty and feeling shame and going through this stupid cycle over and over, right? It's actually for the cycle is not meant to be a cycle. It's meant to be a transformation, right? And it's when we when we willfully neglect the transformation, that it becomes that cycle. It's because we're running from the temptation rather than facing it. And in any dream that I've ever remembered where something was chasing me, the longer I wait to look back to see what this thing is, the bigger it becomes, the smaller I become, and the slower I'm running away. It's gonna get me because I won't face it. Right. And I don't know if you guys are nodding, so you probably shared this experience in the crazy dreams that we all have, where something, this faithless thing, is chasing you, and until you give it a face, it will simply overtake you. You have to face the thing, right? And so the veil has to come off, and she has to face the thing. You know what I mean? And so that's why there's this necessary culmination in the book where there's this, there's the real reflection being shown back, and she recognizes both all of the evil, but also all of the good fruit that was produced by her turmoil, all of those moments of transformation. You know what I mean? Where she's experiencing this thing that she sees as wholly negative, in the same way that we'll experience things that we look in our Christian walk and we're like, God, that was the dark times. You know what I mean? And then when you look back on the convenient side of history that we happen to be on, we look back and go, wow, God used that most. You know?
Two things occurred to me simultaneously as you were talking. First of all of the pain that Orwell caused Psyche was because she was attached to her own pain. And Ungit is the goddess of pain. As she was sitting there with the priest on the opposite side of the Ungit statue, and the woman comes in crying, right? And she's bowed before Ungit, and she's sitting there face down, and then she gets up, takes a breath, and she goes to leave. And my child, did Ungit take your pain? Oh yeah. This is the goddess of pain. This is the goddess that identifies with our pain. We offer our pain to it, and as long as you're offering your pain to Ungit, you're always going to be afflicting Psyche. And secondly, the condemnation of you also will be Psyche was a blessing, that I will make you Psyche. And what feels like a burden, anyone who would come after me will take up their cross, is actually the means by which you're saved. That is not a condemnation. It is not a burden laid upon you. It is the blessing and the means by which you are blessed, which those just occurred to me instantly.
To share in the life and to share in the suffering. Right. Exactly. And so that's kind of what I was talking about, is those means, the means that's being used is in fact the temptation, the suffering, the turmoil, the difficulty, and everything that we look at in our lives. And honestly, most of the reason for apologetics in the modern age is life is hard and everything's inconvenient and it doesn't go how I want it. Why? And it's like, because that's how it works. And we have no idea how well it works. But we want so badly for our lives to be trouble-free. But then there's this, like I said, it's a convenient side of history that you have to be on to look back and recognize that all of the turmoil and suffering that we hate so much is in fact the thing that's actually doing the transformation that we want to come about. And we think the transformation should come first so that the suffering would be made unnecessary. Right? And this is our false step. It's in fact to willfully accept the suffering that brings about the transformation.
Yep. I think that's, you see that the subtlety that you talked about at the beginning of this, that the gods are very subtle, but that subtlety that she decries and complains about and said, well, just make it plain, make it so it's not a decision for me, make it so I don't have to suffer. I'll submit if you just make it plain. That's a prayer that she prays I guess the evening before she puts on the veil and puts on the mask of the queen, is that make it plain and I'll follow. And what you're saying is that's not how God works. That's not how they work. And it's the subtlety that she's decrying that actually becomes the means with which she's redeemed, because she didn't know she was participating in Psyche's labors and carrying the pain and the anguish of those labors on her shoulders. She doesn't realize it. She just realizes that she's in pain. She just realizes that she's in anguish, and that her being queen was a responsibility she didn't ask for and took unwillingly, but she did an amazing job at it. And she looks at it as a bore. Like, this is the thing that's distracting me from my loss of Psyche. And it turns out that it's actually the means in which that she's tempered into the character where, like you said, Sean, that the doom of you also shall be Psyche was not a negative doom. That was a judgment of, I'm going to elevate you. It'll be more subtle than you think.
That reminds me of another book by C.S. Lewis, Out of the Silent Planet, when Ransom is on Malacandra and all of his efforts, every ounce of his motive, every ounce of his drive is in fact to avoid the inevitable meeting that's the culmination of the end of the story, right? And it in fact takes something horrendous and drastic like the death of a best friend in order to succumb to the fact that this is in fact what you were meant to do in the first place. And it was his running that brought about the story. It brought about the pain, but it also brought about the event, that the fact that when Ransom meets Oyarsa, it's actually at Huey's funeral, right? And so it's like this is for me the same thing. He's running from the thing that eventually was not to be avoided, right? Just like Orwell is running from the fact that the gods are revealing something to her. They're just not doing it in the way that she wants them to, right? But the revelation will come. You run. Good luck to you. You'll run, but it's coming anyway, right? And so, like, the fact that she kind of tries her hardest to avoid the meeting of heaven and earth, right? That ultimately the resolve of the story is in fact the meeting of heaven and earth, and so I think it's interesting that Lewis plays with this theme with more than one character and more than one story. But I think in this one he does, and I have to hand it to him. I think he's right. This probably was one of the most grand and deepest and most robust versions of this kind of telling, this kind of, showing that our running away is futile, right? Like I said, when you're running away in the dream, you won't face the thing. It gets bigger, you get smaller, right? It's inevitable. It's the same thing as like if I had a letter from the tax man, and I'm like, yeah, I don't even want to open it, and I put it on the shelf and I leave it alone. Boy, that thing's gonna grow on its own. Just not touching it, just ignoring it is making it grow. I think it's the same reason why when we see the beginning of scripture and in the garden we have a serpent, and by the end we have a dragon. He's been feeding on something, and it's in the shadows. We don't notice it until later. You know what I mean? We don't notice it. We're running from it. Don't look it in the face. But those are the kind of things that seem to happen of their own accord. You know what I mean? And so just another call to our Christian audience. Whatever it is you're running from, your running is futile.
Well,
it really is.
And Lewis does this beautifully in the story, where she had her time where she would speak against the gods, and then they had an opportunity to speak against her, to have their day in court. And so she's there and she's looking at the mural, and in comes Psyche, and she's just down on her face, just praying and pleading, because this is the moment that she knows, I'm guilty, right? Like I have failed, I have caused you pain, and there's nothing that I can do to make it right. And I no longer want you to be mine. I want to be yours. And in that moment, something so precious happens. She doesn't call her Orwell. She doesn't call her king or queen. She calls her Maya. You know, that was her name for her. She's going to call her by a new name, and she's going to, and of course, it wasn't new at that point in the story, but it's a name that is only between them. And then she's going to give her this beauty. And so then when she finally does meet the God, when she looks into the water, she sees two Psyches. And so this moment, this meeting that was going to be something that was going to be terrible and terrifying, finally the gods were going to get their justice. And there's not justice, there's just mercy. And oh man, dude, if there's a moment of that book that will make you cry, it is that section. I mean, I had to pull my garbage truck over and just worship Christ in that moment.
Yeah, man.
Yeah, the intensity of that moment where she's talking with the fox about the gods. Are the gods not just? And he goes, no, imagine what it would be like if they were, right? And at this point where she's starting to actually be honest, actually see herself, actually see the thing that she's the person that she is, all of the lies that she fed herself to continue to go down this wrong path, when she's seeing it and she's realizing and sees the murals and the subtlety of how the gods use that to change her so that she could actually see, to unblind her, to actually see the world of the gods, right? To actually be a part of that and participate. And like you said, when she looks into the waters and sees two Psyches, one clothed and one naked, as in there's two different sides of this. And it is intense. Like you said, if you make it through that after reading the whole story, or multiple times reading the story, make it to that and don't cry going, oh, I'm so glad that justice is not the thing that we get, right? That we get to appeal to God's mercy. But if I'm going to cry for anyone else's justice, is that not also crying for my own? Which is why I cry for mercy, so that I'm also crying for everyone's mercy, you know?
Forgive that we would be forgiven. Exactly. And the thing that really calls out to me, let's say theologically, is if we were to nest this in the Christianese context, right? We have, in fact, a moment at the end of this story where she's experiencing a kind of repentance, and the repentance is made genuine by that moment where she genuinely confesses. She speaks the same. She homologeo. She agrees with what's actually happening, and she says it. She says, "This is what okay. This is what I've done. This is what I've done. I now see it." And so the unveiling portion of our repentance is in fact that confession. Right. I think this is something that's sorely lacking in a lot of the more seeker friendly kind of Americanized churches that's going on, is there's no emphasis on being real with one another. In fact, there's almost this expectation that you would keep your sin veiled so that I don't have to be bothered with it. Mm-hmm. Right. Because I would much rather us all meet together with our Sunday faces, right, than me be my brother's keeper. It's very costly and time consuming and emotionally invested and all these other things that makes it very difficult to love your neighbor. Your neighbor is not terribly lovely most of the time, right? Now, if we reflect this inward, we are also the neighbor, right? Like I am meant to love my neighbor, but I am real quick to point out when I am the neighbor, right? That scenario is real clear to me. But there's always this clouded mystery of how am I supposed to love my neighbor? How am I supposed to do this? And I think that's why Christ says something like, love your neighbor as yourself, that this would be encoded in the law, that this is Old Testament. This is not a new invention. Love your neighbor as you love yourself, right? Is the principle. And it is in fact to say, I know also that I am the neighbor. And this scenario is completely unveiled and clear to me when the roles are reversed, right? And so it's one of those things, like you just said, Troy, when I recognize that the call for mercy for me, if it's not mirrored by the call for mercy for those who sin against me, that I should expect no such mercy. Christ even taught this explicitly.
Mhm.
If you do not forgive, if you do not show mercy, right? The servant who was forgiven his debt, who then goes out and puts a man in prison for a smaller debt,
Mhm.
right? These parables that Christ told, and he told this story in many different ways. He's trying to show us that the other is not merely the external thing. The other is the mirror, like you pointed out in the beginning, Sean. Everybody is a mirror. Everybody is this thing, right? And so all of these principles hang together so neatly in this story. It's really beautiful, right? But the fact that the ending is in fact something that takes the whole story, everything that you just learned about Orwell and the world that they're living in and her own personal motives and all of the things that happen with Psyche and between them and against one another, right? All the manipulation, all the bad advice, just everything that hangs together in the story is all then just baptized in this revelation at the end. And what's really cool is we often think about the past as stagnant and unchangeable. No, the past is in fact something that moves with you, right? And though you can't go back and alter its events, something that happens to you now can in fact change every bit of meaning that was experienced in those events, right? Which is why what we call the dark times of our life can in fact be the batteries for our holy flashlight, if you want to think about it that way. The fuel for the fire is in fact all the dead wood, is it not? Okay? So it's like all of those pieces that have to be broken and fall off, they hit the bottom. Those are the things that fuel up the fire. They'll be burned away and will be refined, right? This is all very scriptural imagery, right? And recognizing that all of this is nested in something as profane as a myth, told by Greeks and Romans of their own sort and retold a thousand times over. It was pointed out in the side chat that a later iteration of this story developed into the Cinderella story. I agree. Very much so, I agree. You have this beautiful girl who's in a humble position with jealous sisters, brought into a castle. The king, the prince, the one who sits in the seat of authority, which for all intents and purposes, if you want to think about it like the Egyptians would be the embodiment of deity. That's why they're meant to be, they're Elohim, right? Like, and so Cinderella meets an Elohim while she's veiled. And the Elohim falls in love with her and seeks her out and has a piece of her that he walks around with and says, do you know this one? Right? So there's a bit of a difference in the story, but you can see the framework. You can see the bones of the story. You know what I mean? All of the drapery that's hung on it is slightly different, but the bones are there. You can see it, and so there's a depth in the way that stories like this echo themselves out throughout other stories that make this something that we can. It's like meeting somebody that you didn't know that you knew. You know what I mean? It's kind of like that, where you discover something that like you already had, but you kind of, it was like nascent. It was in the background. And then this new thing that it's not new, it's new to you. And then it gives shape and form to this thing. It gives solidity to this thing. And no longer is it just some abstract idea. Yeah, God is holy. When you experience a place that puts into you that holiness is here, right? You won't replace it with anything. You can't. You know what I mean? That's one of the things that I think is really interesting too, is that throughout the book, Orwell's view of the holy and of the sacred is very marred and hideous also.
Yep. Through the whole story. And then, well, near the end, she realizes she's become holy. And even in the way that it's described in the book, she's like, I've become that. And then she takes her mask off because her mask revealed her instead of covered her anymore. And then there was a idea that I wanted to, man, I lost it. Darn it. But yes, go ahead. Sorry, that thought was right there on the tip of my tongue and then I just lost it. So
Well,
I'm sure.
and as you said, you know, that she had this marred idea of holiness. That holiness was this dark, stinking, wretched thing. Because in the house of Ungit, it was everything was the smell of burning fat and slaughtered animals, and it was dark and it was dirty. And then when she goes to the holy valley of the gods, it's dark and she can't see anything there. And there's this idea of this: the holiness is this darkness. But interestingly, holiness is actually a reflection of her, because you know, she has this, she doesn't want to look at herself, and so she sees this holiness, it's twisted. And so when she actually comes in contact and she sees, the first time she sees the God, she herself now is beautiful because of the transformation, the what Psyche brought her. So when she encounters true holiness, she herself is now a reflection of that true holiness, which I think is really deep.
To the pure, all things are pure. Yeah, I think that these are that further echoes, but I think that the way that he kind of binds together the seeing and the blindness, right? That there's a darkness about it. And I think this is kind of one of those other things that, if we're not too, arrogant, that we can kind of look for. I think that it's really remarkable that when God reveals himself in the Old Testament, he does so with clouds, with pillars of smoke, with fire, with storms wrapped in darkness. And then by contrast, you have, in fact, in the New Testament, that Satan, when he reveals himself, wraps himself in a disguise of light. He veils himself in something that is light, and it's something that is meant to be attractive, right? And yet when God, like I'm in the example in my head is, in fact, in Ezekiel, when he comes to Ezekiel and it's like there's a crazy storm happening, it's dark and it's terrifying, like the whole thing is terrifying, right? And then, when Isaiah meets the Lord, it's in the temple, right? And like the entire thing is terrifying. Everything about it is just so terrifying. Like the creatures, God's heavenly entourage that are crying, holy, holy, holy. If the only association you have with this word is the terror, right? Like that would have some bearing on it, right? But when God shows up with not the veil of darkness, but with a veil of flesh in the incarnation and reveals himself, he was no longer somebody that you looked at and said, oh, you're terrifying. Like I can't even approach you. Oh, you're so terrifying. Christ was somebody that even the lowliest people around him were willing to approach. You know what I mean? Like the leaders that were around him, that were the authorities, were so bold as to mock and try to trap him with terrible questions. He wasn't terrifying anymore, right? They didn't recognize him, and yet others did. And it's so interesting that the same veil that hides for one reveals for another, right? And we have oftentimes an inclination to look at things. When we hear the word veil, we often think about the veil that's being torn in the temple to the most holy place, right? That veil was also his body. His body was the revelation and the hiding. If God the Father, naked and revealed, came into the creation with nothing between us, no barrier whatsoever, not only we, but all of creation would be undone. Yep. And yet here we are, God, with all of his boldness and remarkable, he shows up wrapped in flesh like us. And we just, when you see it, like, and this is the thing, is I think a lot of people kind of miss out on this also. Christ is fearful. He is. Christ is fearful. He's terrified. He's the judge. He'll have his robe dipped in the blood of his enemies and when in his judgment, in his second coming. But for those who are believers, we won't see him through the eyes of an enemy. He won't be this fearful death, right? Like he'll be, in fact, bridegroom. Life and love, the bridegroom. He is he's the one that came for us. You know what I mean? Like it's so amazing. Like there's so many things that and this is why I love story. When you start to break things down this way and you see, it really does, like Sean said, it makes you worshipful. He gets you in a place where you're just like, this is real. Like, this is not merely like a myth of things. You know what I mean? It's not merely an idea or a story. Christ is real. All of this is, I live in this world. This is the world that I live in, is the one where Christ is real. Right? It's like, how different it could all be if we all lived as though that were true on a more regular basis, recognizing that I am not in a position to judge deity. I am not the main character of my own story. I am not the center of the universe. I am a blessed, privileged participant in a story that is so beyond me that my story finds place in it. And yet, God loves me enough that my story is made center in him, right? And it's only in him that I can occupy a space like the center of the universe. It's because I'm in him, right? And this is the same. This is the same as some of the talk that was in Paralandra at the end of that story, when he's going through the blessing and they're talking about all is center, where God is, that is the center, right? It's like the only time I get to play the role of the center of anything is when I'm unified to the source, right? That's when I can be the center of something, right? But then and when you're in that place, no longer is it about being the center. It is completely natural while being in the center to accept your place in the margin, that I am marginal to the story. And yet the privilege is that I, in fact, participate in both the margin and the center of the story. I do, in fact, get to treat myself as though I matter, right? Because I have value and I have purpose. Where? In my own fancy? No, it's in unity to the source. It's in unity to the Christ, right? That's where I have the purpose and value of a person who can treat themselves like something that matters, right? And so it's like, that's what I think, and I think that's what Orwell might have been perhaps missing, is that self-sacrifice isn't self-sacrifice if the self is not worth anything. That's not sacrifice. You don't sacrifice things that are worthless. You throw them away. Right. And so that's the difference, I think, between people who act carelessly on their own behalf so that they can get something from others because it's striking or whatever. Right. And then there's this kind of moment where, like, well, I did this for you. And then there's this you owe me kind of implication. Right. That's not self-sacrifice. It's not the same thing. It's missing the point. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like, it really
becoming our own benefactor.
Exactly. And so it was the unveiled Orwell in the beginning of the book couldn't have sacrificed self, but the powerful queen toward the end of the book learned to do so.
Well, there was a part in the story when she first discovers I am Ungit, where she realizes that she is worth nothing and she tries to throw herself away. She tries to kill herself with a sword, and she's not strong enough. So she goes to the river and she tries to tie her legs together, and she hears that sound, don't do it. Do not do it. And yeah, you must die before you die. And then she's in that mural and she sees Psyche at the river with her girdle around her legs, and she's the one yelling, do not do it. So yeah, she tried to throw herself away. Sacrifice doesn't look like throwing yourself away. Sacrifice looks at throwing yourself at the feet of God and saying, use me. I am for you. When we assimilate something, we rip it apart, we break it down, and we take the qualities we want. When God uses us, it is a painless burning, and he doesn't break us apart. In fact, he rips the rags off of us and shows us as beautiful. So we will be standing there as a naked psyche without the rags.
That's good.
Fantastic. Well, we just crossed the 2-hour mark and I didn't realize it. Holy moly. Wow. Okay. So this was way faster than I thought. I didn't feel like that was 2 hours. Holy smokes. So, okay, let's see. Do you guys have anything else that you wanted to try to pull out? Or is this a good time to start closing?
Man, there's so much in this book, but yeah, I think that this is a good time to start wrapping up at least this discussion on it. I'm sure there could be other things that we focus on in another discussion because this book has a lot more to offer.
This definitely come up later anyway. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, and that's just, and I finding this is the nature of the Cosmic Corner discussions that I'm having, is that they're all referential to one another, which I think is really cool, because this in some sense shows me that this is something that is based in what I'm trying to do is base all of this in my passion and love for scripture, which is in fact hyperlinked itself, right? And seeing the way that these discussions have had something of the same quality, that these are all hyperlinked with one another. All of these conversations that we've had so far since last August, when I started doing this, was, you know, to see that all of them have this natural progression, but also have a reference callback to others, the way we were doing earlier when I was like, yeah, we did have an episode of that. We had an episode on that. I'm sure that this episode is going to be highly referential for other episodes in future, and I can't wait to revisit it. This has been fantastic. Thanks, BJ. I appreciate that. Okay. If anyone is interested in a more long form, in-depth look at this book, you can find it at both the Literary Life podcast and at even longer form Mythgard Academy. Thank you for that. That's fantastic. If you could, after this video is complete, if you have any links that you can provide for those things, if you want to leave them in the comments, that would be helpful also. But yeah, this is, man, I am pleased. This was fantastic. I thank you guys so much. Yeah, this has been a blessing. Wow. Yeah, that was a really quick 2 hours, guys. I'm looking at this counter right now and I think it's lying to me. That was so fast, but I'm so blessed. And I can't wait to do more conversations like this. Especially with fellas like you guys, because you guys share such a passion and things that I feel like we jive really well. So I appreciate you guys and your willingness to come on here and discuss some of these things and really try to dig deep at something that, you know, perhaps other people will read a book and put it down and it's like, no, man, you're missing out where the sap is. The blood is not in the blood is not in the book. The blood is in the story. You know, so it's like really, really being able to dig deep, and you guys have been a blessing to me. So I appreciate that. Troy, is there anything that you want to say in closing?
Yeah, I've got an excerpt from a book called From Object to Icon, and it talks about masks and veils. And I figured with all the discussion, and just so that you could see we're not the only ones with the ideas that we covered tonight, I wanted to read a little bit of it. So it starts, this is an excerpt from chapter 8 and chapter 9, just a couple minutes. With my masks, the only means of psychological survival in the face of total existential despair. What calls me from the abyss is the voice of the bridegroom, who is Christ. In his homilies on the Song of Psalms, St. Gregory of Nyssa says that the wound caused by tearing away my old fleshly humanity, ripping away my masks, is a wound of love, the point of entry for Christ, O sweet and happy wound, by which life slips through to the inward parts. That is, to remove the masks is to suffer, but unlike the suffering I've endured behind my masks, this suffering is meaningful and creative. Through it, I can find the way, truth, and life, John 14:6. If I can begin to remove my masks, then perhaps I can begin to see the abyss as the chaos out of which creation is possible, as the nothingness out of which God creates everything. Behind my masks, I have lived with the chaos of desires. Whenever I have followed my desires, I've never fulfilled, but always led back to the abyss, to the nothingness. Faced with the abyss, I've always this point turned away from reality and retreated back behind the safety of my masks. But deeper and more real than all this may my need for real encounter remains. That need is also a desire to hear the voice of the other calling to me and to respond in truth, to be seen as I truly am, to be heard singing the song of my heart. I'm hidden away and I want to be found. In order to be found, I need others. I must connect. I cannot do this on my own. So instead of using my imagination to create fantasy, fantastic versions of unreality, I can use it to truly meet the whole different reality of another real person. I can use it to bring me out from the prison behind my mask and connect with another in truth. As C.S. Lewis describes it, the true exercise of imagination, in my view, is A, to help us to understand other people, B, to respond to and some of us to produce art. But it also has a bad use to provide for us in shadowy form a substitute for virtues, successes, distinctions, etc., which ought to be sought out outside in the real world. After all, almost the main work of life is to come out of ourselves, out of the little dark prison we are all born in. I can use my imaginative faculty to build and develop an empathy in truth, representing the unique, different reality of another within me, rather than using it to avoid understanding and empathizing even with myself by detaching myself from my own reality. Instead of losing the real me in the labyrinth of myself, locking the real me behind the mask, I can begin to step out of myself into the other, to form real connections that go beyond the physical. This is by definition the process of ecstasy, ekstasis, moving out from my own place. My aim is not to achieve some kind of ecstatic feeling in my additive behaviors or fantasies, but to step out from behind my mask of protection, to truly connect with the unknown and ultimately unknowable, which will be a transformative experience. In truth, this is the only way to know God at all, as to know him only rationally is, by definition, impossible. The only way to know God is personally, to meet him in his uncreated energies and his creation. And because each human being made in the image of God is a microcosm of God, this is true also for any real meaningful relationship with another human being. We can only truly know anyone personally and interpersonally through encountering them, who they are, how they live out their being, how they relate, and what they create. We can never know another person objectively. This is just an euphemistic cover for objectification.
And that is why trust is the most expensive currency in all eternity. Wow. Thank you, man. Wow. Yeah. I feel like I need a coffee and a walk after that. Oh, Sean, what do you... sorry, I had Troy go first. What do you...
How dare you make
My
me
bad.
fall for that?
Hey, those weren't my words. That's what I'm saying. This book, From Object to Icon, is an amazing, like, it should be a primer for Till We Have Faces, because it's
Wow.
dealing with all of the same things. This perspective of this book is, if there are profane images, there must be holy images. And if you reject the holy images, all you're left with is the profane. So instead of turning to everyone as an icon, you see them as an object. So specifically, it's dealing with the pornography industry and everything else. But the way that he deals with masks and veils, and there's a whole other section on veils that I want to read because it also applies. But that one section is just like everything that we were talking about, summed up in such a beautiful way. So those aren't my words; those are somebody else's.
So if the only thing I feel like I can add is our masks hide us from us. They don't hide us from God.
Right.
He sees me without my mask, and he loves me without my mask. And he says, like Psyche said, your threat to hurt me doesn't mean anything. It never meant anything. But I'm going to do something for you because I love you, and I want you to see you the way that I see you. And some of the hardest things that I've had to do is accept Christ's love for me in those moments where I am just so aware of my failures. And I think that's why when Psyche addresses Orwell, when she's on the ground as Maya, how can I give this to you? I felt that resisting Christ's love in that moment, just because I realized how unworthy I am of it. And it was never about whether I was worthy of it. And so maybe that's just something that I can contribute to the closing of this wonderful episode is your masks don't hide you from God. They hide you from you. And he's trying to take your mask off because it never mattered to him in the first place.
Yeah, don't be surprised that God doesn't love your mask. Don't be off put by the fact that your mask is insufficient, because your mask is only there because you recognize your insufficiency. Piling paint on top of garbage doesn't change the garbage, right? Peter says it this way. I think it's in 2 Peter chapter 2 or chapter 3. He says that you could wash a pig, but it'll go right back to its wallowing. And like a dog returns to vomit, right? Like, I don't know if you guys have ever seen something as disgusting as crude as a dog vomiting and then eating it. That is a very vivid picture. A lot of the time, I don't think we recognize how often the Bible is willing to be very crude with us. But that honesty is necessary. You know, it really is. I appreciate your honesty, Sean, because I share that a lot. I definitely am somebody that's much more willing to be helpful than to ask for help when I need it. And so the Lord's been rebuking me on that recently, and I'm trying to listen, trying to listen carefully, because my mask is something of a Superman, and it's not real. And so I'm trying to grow to be okay with that. And, you know, it's very difficult because I found a lot of meaning in being a stronghold for other people and a help and an influence and a leader. And all those things are a deep blessing to me. But I can't pretend like that's what I am all the time. That's what I am and who I am to some people sometimes. But just like I have to recognize that I also am the neighbor, I also am the weak child, right? I also am the orphan. I also am the widow. I also am the needful person. You know what I mean? And it's weird to say with any sense of humility that I have to learn to need, you know? But it's just one of those reflective, honest moments. And even though it's the closing thoughts of a really remarkable episode, I feel like this can be a time capsule for me to recognize when that honesty comes out and to see what happens with it, you know? So I just want to say thank you, Sean, for saying that out loud, because, man, I needed to. But bless you guys. This has been wonderful. Seriously, this was amazing. And anybody who's still watching right now, bless you also. Thank you for sticking around for the long haul. And if you like what you're hearing on this channel, hit the subscribe button, come back for more. If you like this video, hit the like button, share it with people. If you know any really deep Lewis fans, please share this around. I would really like to see more engagement on ideas like this, not just for the sake of promoting one of our favorite authors, but also for really just taking what it is that he left us and using it, you know? And so if this has been a blessing to me, if it's been a blessing to you, let us know. Leave a comment down below. I do read them. I'll engage with them as much as possible. If you have any questions or anything like that, or you guys want recommendations, or if you have ideas for a book that you want us to go over next time or something like that, let us know. I'm always open to those kind of suggestions, and I really love the engagement. So I appreciate everybody that's listening right now. And I pray that this would go out to people in a way that we're intending it to, and that this would be the blessing that I know it's been to me, to someone else. And I thank you for your time and your attention, and I don't take that for granted. This has been wonderful. Thank you for watching another episode of Cosmic Corner. Good night. God bless. Stay like Christ.